wherever in the world you are, whether it's Brussels or Iran or Cape Town, welcome and to join our call for the Manifesto for the Just Cities. And we are extremely glad to have you here today. And wherever in the world you are, whether very happy that many of you have decided to participate. And we are living in extraordinary times. Climate change, pandemics, conflicts, suffering, leading to migration, growing inequality, and erosion of democracy. And our world is under severe successive shocks. And so if we want to achieve a better world, if we really want to think about this other future, we need to be able to imagine, think about what Farhana Miraftab said last week. And in order to imagine the better world, we need to articulate our ideas so others can partake in our imagination. And we need new and better collective visions for cities and communities that are just, that are inclusive, and that are sustainable. And we are a team at the TU Delft Global Urban Lab, which is the TU Delft platform to discuss issues of urbanization in the Global South. And with this activity, we're also supported by the Delft Global Initiative and the Spatial Justice Network. And Hugo will put the links to these organizations and websites in the chat for you. And I will now give the word to Carolina.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Carolina Naloneta. I'm from IHS, the Institute for Housing and Development Studies. This event is organized in partnership with several universities, IHS, where I work, and also the University of Illinois with Professor Farhana Miraftab, the Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina with Professor Russell Smith, and a number of universities who took up this event as a class exercise. Last week, we had Professor Farhana Miraftab, who talked to us about the need to decolonize our minds and seek for just city that is life-giving rather than profit-making. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Mona Fawaz. She is professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut. She recently co-founded the Beirut the Beirut Urban Lab at the same university, which is a regional research center invested in working towards more inclusive, just, and viable cities. Mona is also the director of the Social Justice and the City Research Program based at the Sam Ferris Institute of Public Policy, also the American University of Beirut. Mona's research spans across urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and law, land, housing, property, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. So before we hear the presentation of Professor Mona, I would like to give the word to Roberto Rocco, who one of the persons leading the Spatial Justice Network.
Hi, everyone. I will, if you allow me, I will share my screen very quickly. I have 3 minutes to convey my message to you, so I'll be super quick. I hope you can see my screen. Let me. I want to. I will time myself. So why are we doing this exercise, and why are we all here? Well, we all know that we are facing successive crises. The world is changing very fast, but not only changing, we have all these public challenges that we have to face. And one of them, obviously, is to make our economies carbon neutral in the next 10 to 50 years. The European Union has launched an European Green Deal. So this is the plan from the European Union to achieve a carbon neutral economy, and it rests on two pillars, as you can see at the bottom: financing the transition and a just transition, leaving no one behind. And obviously, what we are really interested in is in this just transition and what does it mean for us, right? What does it mean to have a just transition and leaving no one behind? We know that we need to talk more and understand much more what social sustainability is. And if you don't know what social sustainability is, simple definition would be the political and economic structures that support environmental sustainability and life in our planet. Justice underscores social sustainability. So without justice, it's very difficult to have social sustainability. And justice means much more than the moral imperative of leaving no one behind, but it also helps, underscores the acceptability, the support, the compliance, the suitability, and the coordination of policy. What does all that mean? That means that we need good, effective, transparent, accountable governments that are democratic and that will listen to their citizens so that we can achieve also environmental sustainability. Without that, we cannot have it. The transition is urgent, but is it going to be fair? And I'm not going to talk about the two dimensions of spatial justice that maybe I would just say there are two dimensions we have to think about. One is the distributive justice, so how we distribute the burdens and benefits of development, but also the procedural justice, which means the instruments and procedures through which this distribution is negotiated. So basically planning and so on. And this exercise that we are going to do is visioning, a manifesto for the just city. And we are super, super happy to tell you that there are 475 participants. Some of you are on the screen right now. We have, I haven't counted how many countries yet, but I'm sure it's they're in all continents. And we have so far 75 groups enrolled to write a manifesto. In the first book, so in the first edition, we had 43 groups. So I hope you are enthusiastic about it. We are going to publish this in a book, all the manifestos in a book, and these are our pages from the last year's book. So we are going to try to make it even more beautiful this time. But I wanted to show you this so that you can have an idea of where we are going. And with that, thank you so much. I think we can continue, but let me see.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, go on.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Very nice. Yeah, I think we can continue now. We'll give the floor to our speaker, Professor Mona Fawaz. We will talk about urban informality. Is the formal, informal, an enactment to the right to the city? Please, Professor Mona, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone, really, first for this invitation and the generous introduction. And also, thank you for this very inspiring work. I'm completely wowed by the idea that so many people are dreaming of a different kind of city, and really humbled to be able to speak to you guys tonight. So I hope I'll be able to contribute. I'll start by saying that one of the requests that Roberto made to me was to try and talk a little bit more about what planners can do and what planners can do in places like Beirut, where I live, where the possibility of imagining a democratic, inclusive state from which you can ask more justice or more green is very remote. And so how do we reimagine our places as planners, as professionals of the built environment in thinking about that? So I tried to gear my presentation towards that, including nonetheless a good conversation, hopefully, about informality. And I guess I'll just start with that by sharing my presentation and ask you guys to please let me know when I only have 3 or 4 minutes left, so I make sure I wrap up. So I'm trying to go into full mode. I think we're there. All right. So So the informal. So let's start with Beirut first, where over the past year, the port blast has brought substantial attention to the city and particularly to its housing sector. As many non-governmental and international non-governmental organizations began to work on the repair of what was estimated at over 100,000 houses affected by the port explosion nearby. These organizations found themselves basically responding to layers and layers of neglect and damage that predated the blast by at least 5 decades. It was not only just dilapidated building or services that didn't function well, the poor physical condition or the redistributive apartments that presented a challenge. There was also a lot of questions about like property rights, who owns what in these neighborhoods, but also rental contracts that didn't seem to make sense. Who was allowing who to stay in a place? How much did people pay? How long did the pay change? And then issues of personal entitlement, like do you have legal papers? Do you have the right to be here? Questions that we basically often hear in the formal and informal sectors, right? And when you look at neighborhoods such as Karantina, which you're seeing on your picture here, it would seem that it's normal that we ask such a question. This is, after all, largely considered a dilapidated informal settlement. But the same questions were being asked of Mar Mikhael, which is Beirut's more consolidated, hip, upcoming neighborhood, where heritage buildings seem to be raising the same questions, as did more modern buildings also along the neighborhood. It seemed that it was impossible to tick a clear box on the categories that relief workers and planning agencies wanted to assess damage or identify claimants. Reality, in other words, was far more complex than a sheer survey of building damage or a list of claimants. And in the months that followed the blast, as the COVID crisis raged and everything in the country was in free fall, the volatility of the condition seemed to raise many more questions for people trying to fix homes. To give you just a picture, our national currency has lost more than 90% of its value over only a few months. So that means that if you're renting a home, your landlord is renegotiating on a daily basis how much rent you're paying. And if you don't really have a contract, you don't have any grounds to actually negotiate it. The cost of materials and repair was becoming more and more expensive. And for those few people who managed to get some repair compensation, the question of whether you pay for food or medicine or you repair your home became really important. Another question was really how do we position ourselves as planners? It was evident that some of the basic assumptions that we hold in our profession do not stand to Beirut's reality. So let's begin with that idea that there's a public agency. Here, the municipality, the Director General of Urbanism, the housing agencies had just fully delegated the reconstruction to NGOs and INGOs, and the residents seemed really not to want the state to come in. But how do we plan if we don't have a custodian of the common good? How do we design a recovery if no one is coordinating the work of all these actors? Even worse, what we call public was completely absented from recovery. So we had the Lebanese army that was making sure that the right NGOs were entering the neighborhoods, but that was really the extent of the public. And conversely, spaces like these, and this is the Beirut Urban Lab working with the community on how should we imagine recovery, but places like this, where a public space, a sidewalk, that are considered shared public spaces, had not only no custodian, but no one trying to repair them. So the public was really missing. And that's a point I really think is important for us to think about as planners when we think about what is our role in all of this. So as I found myself as a planner, a university professor, again, one more time in Beirut, speaking to relief agencies, speaking to international organizations about why the state is absent, why is everything so fluid and unregulated, I found myself again and again resorting to the terminology of informality. Of course, the term has been widely used in the planning literature since the 1970s. So it refers to a form of housing, a modality of transaction, more generally an order of governance that occurs outside the direct presence of state agencies or state regulations. And yes, as such, Beirut's landscape, I could explain, was highly informal. And it was not just informal settlements or confined to particular neighborhoods. It was basically in every neighborhood, almost everywhere. But while arguing that transactions are informal can provide some clarity for actors looking to classify and order a reality, help them understand that a lot works through temporary tactical arrangements, as Abdul Malik Simon has taught us, for example. It doesn't respond to the critical question of, is this informality desirable? In other words, if we as planners believe that our profession is about helping in the making of the just city, like this workshop tells us to do, should we be embracing this informality as desirable? Does the absence of a state make for a more just city? I don't claim today that I'll be able to answer this very challenging question. However, I argue that at least for planners invested in the just city, we should pay more vigorous attention about how power dynamics play at multiple scales of the arrangements that organize people's everyday lives. In other words, we should extend our attention beyond the dual state-citizen relation and try to understand power as more diffuse in society. This is not a ticket at all to elude the larger structural injustice, to the contrary, but to recognize that particularly in contexts where the illusion of a strong custodian of the common good embodied in the state is very far-fetched, where citizenship is really not on the table. And in those neighborhoods and elsewhere in Lebanon, just to give you one example, 1 in 4 people is a refugee. So we're talking about people who don't have legal papers to actually be there. Planners and planning need to shift this understanding of the common good from something that has a predefined custodian, that has a predefined definition, to a work in the making, a project, something that we need to imagine and work together through a process. So that's sort of my big message for today. But before I go there, let me turn back to informality. I had promised to speak about it, and so I'd like to start there from Lima, as you can see this. Cities like this, where the images like this have circulated a lot in the planning literature since the 1960s. The contrast between imagined planning's ordered futures, right? The modern structures and those unruly realities, right? Those realities that do not correspond to how planners and city governors imagine the city to work. Those realities often described as unplanned, unregulated, where zoning doesn't apply, property rights are not necessarily observed, building law is rarely protected. Such realities correspond also to markets where transactions are unrecorded, are realities that we often associated with cities of the global south. So there's a beautiful literature that as of the 1960s, 70s within planning begins from Latin America, where we begin to learn about words like favela, barrio, villa miseria, that really occupy people's imagination and become part of the lexicon of planning. It translates a reality that eventually is also documented in Latin America, in East Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa, but also more recently in the colonias of the United States, for example, where we see that along the borders of Texas, Arizona, and California, yes, similar informal neighborhoods have actually developed. So in order to explain the discrepancy between how planners imagine the word and then how really planning works, the mainstream of planning has coined this terminology of informality. And like Lisa Pitti said, it's a term that's vague, that cannot be really defined, pinned down practically, but it's a term that has a use. And that use in Watson's word is very important. It's one that points to those dominant, persistent realities that clash with what planners put as normality, what is proper, what is clean, what is orderly. And so against the normality, informality becomes this emblem of disorderness, of the unregulated, of the uncontrolled, the messy, the inefficient. And of course, this has a lot of repercussions. But before we talk about let's just think about for a second, how do planners explain that? How do planners come to define to themselves the difference between, on the one hand, the clean, ordered city that they promise to design, and on the other, the reality of most of the world? So there's two tropes in planning that I think are very important to consider in this early literature. One is survival, and the other is transience. Both of these realities have in common that they're trying to explain really why is it that right now the reality doesn't correspond to how, as a planner, I have organized the city or designed it. The survival trope is the earliest. It's very common. You see it in a lot of the classics. I've tried to put a few here for students who are interested. But basically, it holds that people are poor, they can't afford to live in cities. So you're going to have to, in exclusive capitalist cities, you're going to have to accept the fact that to survive, they have to break the law. And there's, of course, many versions of this literature, with one that celebrates really the entrepreneurship, for example, with Squatters and Oligarchs and David Collier's famous work, but also with Janice Perlman, the aspirations of being a bourgeoisie, the perseverance of pioneers, the values of patriots, she wrote in 1976. Taken to date, I mean, a lot of us, I think a lot of people here are architects. This remains a strong conversation where we see Briand-Bourg, we see Teddy Cruz and others really engaging with informality as a site of inventiveness, ecological, recovering waste, aestheticized poverty, yes, of course, but it's important to consider that this is really a continuity of that same idea that people are surviving, and we need to recognize that as part of our cities. On the other hand, there's this other promise, the promise of transience, which basically says that this is temporary. It lasts for a certain period and it will change. And of course, the champion here was John Turner, who convinced basically international organizations, including Habitat International, that this was a better form of building because it allowed people to have a housing project in which they conceived of housing, as he famously put it, as a verb, right? So people are building their own homes. They are working towards a project, and we should allow this transitory phase before their houses consolidate in ways that would actually be more adequate to their needs than those defined by the state. This is again a trope that we continue to see, and it's interesting, Caldera recently documented it still in Sao Paulo, where she points that people inhabit spaces that are clearly precarious, but where they feel that they will improve, that they have the promise that one day they will be wealthier and that they will be part of, and that they will look, their neighborhoods will look as part of a better city. Now, both survival and transience have in common this assumption that it's possible, perhaps even inevitable, that planning will extend its scope over urban territories, that it's unstoppable, it's a development process. And as such, the tropes allow planners to address informality as an aberration and to depict laissez-faire as almost a strategy. It also makes it possible for planners to limit the scope, the imagination of how do we react towards neighborhoods like this, or towards the increasing informalized urban quarters of many, many cities in ways that say we're going to fix them, we're going to regularize them, we're going to upgrade them, we're going to improve them, always trying to formalize that informal, to bring it back to that standard that is imagined. However, decades later, it's evident that the assumption that informality is transient doesn't stand the test of time. Rather than expanding its scope over cities, we know that planning in many cities, planning understood as the public exercise of ordering space and providing services, is actually reducing its scope. We see piling evidence from both the global north and the global south, where we see city authorities with outdated bypassed master plans that they themselves ignore, designing small enclaves for the rich where city governments can work. Famously, if you look around us here in the region, in the Middle East, from Cairo's new capital to Tehran's imagined new capital, there is that aspiration that we're building something else which is smaller, which departs from the city and loses the hope of fixing it. So a few decades ago, it was maybe possible to imagine that things were unusual, that they will continue to pin it on civil wars, on colonization. But I think that today we're increasingly seeing that this is a reality that we have to reckon with. And to think about how to address this reality, I think the most important contribution that planning theorists have done is to reinfuse a notion of power and politics in our reading of informality, because that allows us then to consider the circumstances, the processes in which these neighborhoods developed. And so in thinking about how to infuse power, and this really beautiful work, I mean, I put a few of the literature, a few of the books that have addressed these issues, and you can see they're not new since the 60s. This conversation has been going, but it's been now really expanding. What is interesting about it is that it basically allows us to think back of notions of politics defined as an exercise of collectivity, and to try and read informality in relation to these realities. I think someone's microphone is open, maybe. Thank you. So how have planners infused power in the conversation of informality? I have to say, I was reading Professor Rocco's book a couple of days ago, and I noticed that I have exactly the same understanding of how power is infused. So that's what do you say? Like, that's a recognition that, wow, I mean, it's there. I shouldn't be thinking about it. But in any case, I think there's two ways in which power really emerges in the discussion of informality. On the one hand, scholars have really argued that informal practices embody resistance. It's resistance to oppressive, exclusive structures. And early versions of the argument celebrate the entrepreneurial spirit of the poor. We just mentioned it. But more recently, we have notions like Colston's insurgent citizenship, Miraftav's invented citizenship or invented participation, Asif Bayat speaking of politics of encroachment. All of these basically what they're trying to do is to infuse an understanding of politics, of agency, but also of agency with the necessity to be recognized in one's acts in the actions of informal settlers. And here I disagree a little bit with Professor Rocco, but I think that a lot of this really comes from Lefebvre's notion of the right to the city. In its original formulation, it comes again and again in the work of as an influential reflection that infuses an act of politics in the way in which individuals challenge the oppressive rules of both the state and capitalism. And I think capitalism here is key. And how they then enact politics, not by asking someone, and that's where really I think the right is misunderstood often in the literature, but to actualize their presence in the city through direct occupation. So it differs distinctively from the uses of the right to the city, where we expect the state to bestow some kind of entitlement based on one's citizenship. Rather, there is a progressive potential of taking back the power by yourself enacting that right to the city, occupying the land, embodying actually in your actions, sorry, that that possibility, making it become an actual urban possible. And so we see this a lot in Holston's notion of insurgent citizenship, in which residents in the auto-constructed peripheries of Brazilian cities confront regimes of inequality not by waiting for the state to give them something, but by actually themselves building their neighborhoods. Something very similar is read in Benjamin's work of occupancy urbanism in India, but also in South Africa with Faranak Miraftab, and the work of communities that resist eviction and get their own service hookups. It's noteworthy that some of these authors see a continuity between these acts of negotiation and the acts of protest that we saw across the world including in the Middle East, actually, in the last decade. I want to emphasize this for planners because I think it's very important. What exists in those protests is that they're occupying places where very often residents were not allowed to actually gather or be together as a community. And so what is being enacted in this action here is the possibility of a collectivity. And through the actions of, I can speak of our experience in Beirut downtown in 2019, what you see happening is that places that were allocated for power, for cars, for businesses, become appropriated and reimagined and redesigned through a performative act by the protesters. So they become soup kitchens, they become free psychotherapy places, they become communal discussion spaces. And by organizing this space this way, by enacting this organization, there is another possibility which is set in place that becomes very inspiring for people because it allows us to transcend the boundaries that we're required to stay in. And that's the continuity that particularly Teresa Caldera points to when she speaks about a political potential in the informal settlements, because they actually really enact that actual alternative. Of course, this literature has also been tagged as being romantic, as letting the state, in a classic Marxist way, really get out very easily. Because it's since the 1970s with Burgess's work, because then we're accepting the fact that there is no responsibility on the authorities that exclude city dwellers. So the other way in which power is infused, if it's not resistance, is actually in the power of exclusion. It's in the power of actually being unjust, by designing cities that are from the beginning exclusive, that de facto consider large sections of the population as undesirable. And the literature points out very rightly that the actors who define what is legal and what is not legal are state actors. So it's the state as an institution which decides what will be in and what will be out. And that power cannot be bestowed on anyone else. So that distinction needs to be thought of critically. We see it in terms of planning regulations already with John Turner, but we also see it from an understanding that connects it to a notion of class domination as early as in the late 70s with de Sousa Santos in Brazil. Since then, numerous studies have documented biases embedded in urban regulations and property rights that show that basically there are huge repercussions to actually being called unplanned or unregulated or undesirable. It is not simply that you're put outside, but there's a whole system of power that gets unleashed if you're considered outside state law, right? Informal. And that works against your inclusion or the imagination of rights. Some of the interesting points are made, for example, in the 1990s by Ayşe Yonder in Turkey or Raquel Rodnik in Brazil, where they point to the fact that city maps show these green areas and they basically hide the informal settlements. So they don't exist, they're erased. But being erased, being off the book, means eventually that you can also be bulldozed when the need for a big public project is set on the table, or included if elections require it. In the last 2 decades, a lot of studies have documented massive population displacements attached to a neoliberal system of governance that finds it easy to revoke sometimes right, and most importantly, displace people who are then tagged as informal and hence losing their rights. I picked on the Olympics as a powerful moment, both in China to the left, where over 1 million people were displaced ahead of the Olympic Games, and to the right, Rio, ahead of the World Cup and the Olympics, where dozens of thousands of people were displaced. And what we see in both of these is that the tag of informality is deployed against residents in these cases, and that consequently they lose their right to the just city. So
Mona, just to give you, for your control, you have 5 minutes more.
Thank you for pointing this out. So I'm going to stop reading and jump then to try and conclude. So what I wanted to tell you is that these readings are very problematic because they basically both locate all of power in relation to the state. And they don't think of the fact that power is much more diffuse than simply relations between the state and people. So when I go back to Beirut, if I go back to Beirut for the last 5 minutes to sort of make a point about this, and we look at the map of the city with the port explosion and the site of the port explosion, we found that the city is rife with buildings that we have documented in the urban lab to be under threat of eviction, of displacement. Buildings where, as I described before, in the entire city, residents live in conditions of high informality. Their occupancy, as is the case here, for example, is temporary. It rests since 1973 on the fact that the people who built the buildings disagreed between each other. Then the Civil War started. They had sold some of the property, not all of it. And so what you end up with is 50 years later, a structure with multiple stories, with multiple apartments and histories, hosting migrant workers, refugees on oral contracts, who negotiate their presence on regular basis with their individual landlords, but also with the local strongman of the neighborhood. You also end up with scenarios like this, where developers are going to come and buy a cluster of buildings and compete over that cluster that they hope to demolish so that they can actually replace it with a high-end building that brings a lot of money. And when they don't manage to get a full cluster awaiting for an opportunity of redevelopment, they're going to rent it out temporarily as individual rooms. Heritage buildings held because of the rent gap. Again, landlords trying to get rid of the tenants, not allowing anyone to even fix the building after the port blast. Why am I saying all of this? And I wanted to go to all these cases to say that what creates this informality is not simply that planning agencies are putting wrong rules or that they're all powerful and displacing residents. What creates that informality is primarily the fact that the city has been turned in so many ways as a financial asset, and that what is happening is an everyday negotiation between those who want to stay in the city because they need a place to live, and between those who want to invest in the city. And both groups should not be imagined as homogeneous or holistic. The two groups are actually extremely mixed. They both operate within a context of public policy making, which I had mapped here thinking I had much more time. I'm sorry, I miscalculated. But both groups, what I was trying to show here, operate in a context where the city is actually itself highly financialized. Its fabric is turned into a substance that is used to attract foreign currency into the country, keep stability, and consequently allow for profit to be made. But in this context, people are negotiating on one-to-one between each other their right to stay in the city in all these scenarios and others. But the practice is that these negotiations are happening at a much more private individual level and way less into the collective action imagined by those who are thinking that there is a redistribution of powers. So what does this leave us as planners thinking about? What I want to leave you thinking about in terms of the possibilities of planning, and I think there are plenty, is that we need to first and foremost think that planning has to refocus the attention on the collective. That housing is not simply an issue of going into an informal settlement and bringing it into the city, or going to any of the scenarios that I wanted to describe to you in which negotiation is happening over the right to stay in the house or to upgrade it or even to fix it after an explosion. But actually planning needs to take back that question and imagine the possibility of a collectivity that demands that puts together a collective demand, because that's the critical issue about planning. And where I disagree with a lot of colleagues who in the last decades have insisted on the centrality of the role of the state in being the custodian of the common good, and hence being either to be brought in recognizing rights or not, I want to think that it is possible to build collectivities at the local level from the bottom up, that around shared common issues where planners can really work in every context to imagine the possibilities of a just neighborhood. It can start around a shared space or a demand for housing. It doesn't let the power off the hook, but it should not at any point assume that the custodian of the common good, that the principle of that collective is a predefined we in cities that are increasingly divided. And that's where I think Lefebvre's genius lies. It's in allowing us to start thinking from the space we share as opposed to our identities, and to think, how are we going to live together? And that's the power of planning. I think this is why planning is such a powerful field. And I still want to be a planner despite everything we've done to people in the last years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. And I'm really sorry for having...
I'm sorry, I miscalculated my time, not at all.
No. I'm really sorry for speeding you up, but just for us to have a good conversation. What you say is super interesting for us. I think, and you know, if you maybe please don't call me Professor Rocco, because I feel very, very old when you do that, which I am, by the way.
I don't think I'm much younger. I don't think I'm younger actually, but I can pretend.
But for me, the role of the state is a big question. Is very central for me, and I'm saying this for the benefit of all 218 people at the moment who live in Sweden or in Iran or in the United States or in China, and where the state means something completely different for each of them, right? Could you tell us a little bit more, because there are questions already coming in, by the way, but could you tell us a little bit more about what happens when the state crumbles, like in Lebanon, where there is almost no state present anymore?
It's a very, very good question. The first point I want to make is that there's nothing to celebrate in what I think is we're heading towards, which is some kind of a republic of the NGOs. And I tried to write about this with my colleague Mona Fawaz, because we lack someone who can coordinate the work of these organizations, and more practically, we also lack a custodian of the common good. And really, what I tried to point to in my presentation is the extent to which non-governmental organizations were going towards houses and trying to fix individual houses, while everything that is public and that requires a collective is being absented precisely because the city authorities are absent. So it's not about saying that the recipe is that there is no state, but it is to challenge ourselves, I guess, as planners to think about the state as one potential project of a custodian of the collective, and to work towards its building, but not take it for granted, and not limit our work to that of advocacy, of asking from the state to act in a way that we have seen it cannot act.
Absolutely. In that sense, I think we are really on the same page. There are quite a few questions. Well, there is one question actually from Bagheri. Bagheri, would you like to say your question?
Doesn't matter. Should I read it?
Yeah. Well, okay, I will read it. I have a question. It's mostly about the paper we had to read this week. It was a brilliant explanation of a situation. But when it came to the solution, you talk about resiliency and that planning can help with some of the problems. Aren't you afraid by talking about bouncing back and planning can solve it? We as planners are sending the message to the state empirical power to capitalists that you do your thing and it's going to be fixed. I'm not sure I'm following the question. Bagheri, can you explain to us?
And it's the concern that if we constantly talking about that we are going to do something and we are going to be resilient, we are not looking to the fact that there are some powers that doing this to us. For example, as Syrian refugees, they're not this many of them there because of, they weren't resilient. There was a power that made them like this. By sending the message that it's a fixable situation, aren't we kind of telling them that you can punch us and we can bounce back?
Yeah, go on.
I mean, can I just say something? I think if there's one thing that that we've all learned to hate, it's the term resilience. And in the last 2 years, if you follow Lebanon's Twitter, you will see all the activists doing hashtag I am not resilient. So because resilience has been limited to that notion that we can take all the oppressive decisions that are made by the government, that it's fine, that we can still manage. No, we cannot manage, and there's nothing normal in what we're going through, and it should be unacceptable. But I think it's also not unique when you look at how most cities are governed. We need to be looking for signposts, for ways to make things different. And I guess this is the message that this is the thing that I'm struggling the most with these days. Sort of, where do you go from here? There was something, I tried to conclude with this, there was something about planning, right? That it talked about the common good, that it upheld this. At a time where we criticized modern planning a lot, and we said that it was unjust and it was imposing standards, but it was also upholding rights. There was a concern, there was a notion of citizenship that we've lost in the last 20, 30 years with financialization. And so I feel that, I guess I don't know if I'm answering properly, but I feel that we need to find ways to recover that notion of the collective, so that my problem is not my problem with my landlord, but my problem is with the structures that organize my city, but I can't do it on my own. So who is we? And that we is really disappearing. I mean, in Beirut, it's really not here. So we have to create it. And I think this is where I feel that we need to be inclusive of different things in different places. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's my...
Sorry, I was muted. You're totally making sense. We have to be very suspicious of the word resilience. Resilience doesn't mean that we are in a good state. And a lot of very poor people are very resilient. It doesn't mean that it's fair, right? Safia, you have a question? Guys, you can raise your hands if you have questions. Safia, go on.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hi, Dr. Mona. I'm really grateful to be able to attend one of your talks again. Always refreshing. Let's say that my topic of prédilection, my favorite topic is to talk about informality, and I'd love to hear more about it from you. So as you said, it's very hard to define informality. Indeed, it's sort of that ambiguity that defines informality. As far as I'm concerned, and based on the literature, I think that informality is the bigger scheme, and formality is just an extraordinary occurrence that happened thanks to sort of, can I say, like a lucky meeting of planning and environment and context to make the formal city. So I really want to hear more about it from you, especially that I think that, as you said, informality might be an enactment to the right to the city as defines it as well. Could you elaborate more on this point, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I navigated towards the term informal when I started thinking about how and what governs and organizes people's everyday lives. And as long as informality was used as a negative, as an illegality, I found it very truncated and really responding only to that notion of the centrality of state law, which of course is very strong, but it's not the only thing. And so I began to think about informality increasingly in the everyday life of people as, if you want, as the process that recognizes there's a lot of rules in our everyday lives. And some of these rules are state laws, and those rules are basically supported by public agencies. And then some of those rules are norms, they're supported by all sorts of social institutions. And these transactions, these interactions that people have, then are considered informal. And so when you start thinking this way, you look at a neighborhood, you look at a housing context, and you start thinking about, okay, so what do I do if I take stock of all the different ways in which people are securing their homes, and who's securing them and how? And then I understand who's more powerful than who. In my dissertation, 20 years ago, I thought about a concept which was who has backing, and it comes from Arabic. I'm guessing you speak Arabic. In Arabic, we say elo dahr, he has back. And so in the neighborhoods where I was working, I would hear this all the time from people. How come you got evicted and he didn't? It's because he has a back. And so that tells you that it's not necessarily more just or less just, but it allows you to understand better the complexity of everyday realities in which people are living. I understand that that's the way I've been using informality, but there are many other definitions. There was a beautiful paper written by Lisa Pitti in the late 70s that basically said, or early 80s, that said, stop using the term. It's useless. It's all over the place. It says everything and nothing. And I recall as a PhD student, maybe 20, 30 years after, me asking her, how do you feel about this paper? And she said, it's a term that really responds very well to the need of planners to explain something they're having a hard time with. That's why it stayed. And so I think we plug it in different places to mean different things. And it's important that when you're thinking and writing about it, that you define it, how you're using it, why it's, yeah. I hope this is helpful. And I'm happy to send you any references you're interested in after. We can exchange email or something.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much. Carlos, would you like to say your question? It's quite a long one.
Sure, I can. I should have written it. It's long. Mona, thank you very much for your presentation. One of the reasons for informal organization, at least in the origins of it in Latin America, was the incapacity of formal planning organizations to respond to the speed of migration to urban areas. So by declaring they're informal was a way to avoid saying they're illegal, which, you know, strictly legally they were, but allow these planning organizations to avoid the problem of having to deal with it. That is still the problem in developing areas of developing countries and developed countries, as you will say, in areas of the south of Texas, Arizona, California, and the states that lead, are next to Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so, do you think? I mean, my main concern is I don't think this is an issue that can be solved very easily when you have the pressure of people trying to leave. And the organizations that are responsible to make the room for that, they can't respond, and so they just let it happen. But they don't have to deal with it. Do you think that, formally speaking, is there a way for governments to respond to this pressure?
I mean, I think the prime reason why informality develops, I mean, if we think of informality as substandard housing, which is how I'm guessing you're thinking about it, people who live without proper services, whose presence is criminalized because it's in violation of the law, and so they remain fragile. If we think of planning this way, then we want to ask ourselves, so how come they can't move inside the city? And we know that it's not governments who build housing in most of the world, it's the market. So we've designed basically cities that favor capital over people, and that give priority to the protection of private property, and it's in the form of freehold over someone's right to use that land as a home. And so if the point was really that governments were struggling with how to house the illegal migrants from South America coming into Mexico and California, or any other context in which we see this, I think that it would have been possible to solve it if the priority was people. The problem, the challenge then is that the priority is not people, and that in the way in which we're governed, the priority is the market. And I think in Lebanon, it's so clear that there is so much public investment, in state investment, I should say, in protecting private property and making it desirable to place one's money in land. And that's very common under financialization in almost any context I've read about. Then what you see is that it becomes harder and harder for people to find the way to manage making a home. And so I think that if governments want to intervene, we should be fighting financialization and land as assets, rather than focusing simply on these neighborhoods as if the problem can be dealt with within them. They're just a part of a larger process. I hope this is making sense.
If I may, sorry, we have to move on, Carlos. I'm really sorry, if you don't mind, because there is a question from Elena. She can't use the microphone, so she asked me to read. In the context of informality, where does the middle class stand, since the narrative emphasizes the role of two opposing forces, the lower classes and the capitalist state? What do you think, Mona?
I think that increasingly with global financialization, we're hearing about the middle class as being referred to as the missing middle. I don't know if you've heard this term, but there's an encroachment of informality, understood as the temporary unprotected condition of people's access to housing in many European cities as well, not only in cities of the South. And the reason is, again, that the way in which we're regulating our cities is particularly prone to allowing capital to take more and more of the spaces of the city. I don't want to repeat myself. There was a report that came out about a month ago from the IMF, interestingly, about 14 European cities. And it talked about a contrast between mortgage holders and tenants. And it described the increasingly difficult conditions that tenants were facing in being able to keep their homes and being thrown into more precarious conditions, and referred to them as the falling middle, I think, which echoes the literature on the missing middle. And I think that this is where we should be really careful. I don't think it's anymore simply working class rural migrants or refugees and informal settlements in the urban peripheries. I think more and more city dwellers are finding themselves in more vulnerable condition, forced to rent without proper contracts, with more uncertainty. Ananya Roy has written beautifully about this being also the outcome of a deliberate public strategy that wants to allow itself to move people as it wishes. And so it becomes a mode of governing people in which you can have more and more precarious people. And I think that in the current trajectory in which we are, in many contexts, it's not necessarily just the urban poor.
Well, thank you so very much. I just want to highlight the fact that instead of the global South, catching up with the North, becoming more like the North, I think the developed world is becoming more like the developing world right now. And people even in the middle classes are starting to feel the pressure of neoliberalism, of the commodification of the, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Mona, on behalf of the Delft University of Technology and my colleagues and our partner universities, I thank you so very much for your contribution tonight. This workshop is being broadcast live on YouTube, and it will be available later. But we are now going to have a small break of 3 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, and we are going to come back. And then my colleague Caroline, if she's still there, will explain the exercise, because I'm terrible explaining the exercise to you. We are going to do an exercise in breakout rooms. Mona, thank you so very much. It was such a pleasure for me to meet you and to see you talking. Oh, and I'm sure we have much more to talk about.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the questions. That was very generous. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Guys, we are having a 3-minute break. So let's come back at 8:05 for the last part of the exercise. Please don't go away. We are going to be back in 3 minutes. See you.